Navy Lieutenant Commander John McCain stared down at the metal bowl in front of him. The contents defied description. A watery, brownish liquid with chunks of something floating on the surface. The smell hit him first. Rotten vegetables mixed with fish that had been dead for weeks. This was the Hanoi Hilton, October 1967 mealtime. What the North Vietnamese served their American prisoners wasn't just bad food. It was psychological warfare served in a bowl. These men had flown million-dollar aircraft, commanded respect, lived the American dream. Now they were being fed slop that wouldn't be given to animals back home. But here's what nobody expected. This wasn't neglect. This was strategy. 3 hours earlier, McCain had been flying his A-4 Skyhawk over Hanoi on his 23rd bombing mission. The surface-to-air missile that brought him down shattered both his arms and his right leg. When he hit the water of Truc Bac Lake, he was already broken. The mob that dragged him from the lake wanted blood. They'd been watching American bombs fall on their city for months. Here was their chance for revenge. They stripped him naked, spat on him, kicked his broken bones. Someone drove a bayonet through his foot. Another person smashed his shoulder with a rifle butt. McCain was dying. The North Vietnamese knew it. They also knew he was valuable alive. The truck ride to the prison compound lasted 30 minutes through the streets of Hanoi. Every bump sent fire through his shattered bones. Vietnamese civilians lined the streets, screaming, throwing rocks. Some tried to climb onto the truck to get at him. When the truck finally stopped, McCain got his first look at Ho Lo prison. The French had built it in 1896 to break Vietnamese revolutionaries. Now, the Vietnamese would use it to break Americans. The guards who carried him inside weren't medical personnel. They were interrogators. And they had one simple philosophy. A man who's hungry and in pain will tell you anything you want to hear. They threw McCain into a concrete cell, barely 6 feet wide. No bed, no blanket. A bucket in the corner for waste. The tropical heat made the air thick and suffocating. Rats scurried across the floor. But the real torture hadn't started yet. The first Vietnamese officer who questioned McCain spoke perfect English. He'd studied at American universities. He knew American culture, American weaknesses, American psychology. He looked at McCain's broken body and smiled. "You will cooperate," he said, "or you will starve." McCain had trained for capture. Every pilot knew the code of conduct: name, rank, serial number, date of birth. Nothing else. The training covered interrogation techniques, isolation, even physical torture. Nobody had prepared them for what came next. The guard who brought McCain's first meal looked almost apologetic. The bowl contained what appeared to be soup, but the liquid was gray and thick. Chunks of unidentifiable matter floated on top. The smell was overwhelming, like sewage mixed with rotting fish. McCain was starving. He hadn't eaten in 18 hours. His body was burning calories trying to heal his broken bones. He needed food desperately. He took one spoonful and immediately vomited. The guard watched this happen and shrugged. He picked up the bowl and walked away. McCain wouldn't eat again for 2 days. This wasn't an accident. The North Vietnamese had studied American prisoners from the Korean War. They knew exactly how long a man could survive without food. They knew when hunger would override disgust. They knew when desperation would break down psychological barriers. More importantly, they knew that food could be a weapon more effective than any torture device. Other American prisoners were arriving daily: Air Force pilots, Navy aviators, Army helicopter crews. Each one went through the same process: capture, beating, transportation to prison, then the introduction to their new diet. The reactions were always the same: shock, disgust, refusal to eat, then hunger, then the terrible choice: eat the unthinkable or starve to death. Some prisoners lasted longer than others. The younger ones often broke first. The older, more experienced officers sometimes held out for weeks. But eventually, everyone ate. because the alternative was death. And death, the North Vietnamese had learned, ended the interrogation process. They needed their prisoners alive, desperate, and completely dependent on their captors for survival. The food was just the beginning. Hoa Lo Prison earned its nickname from American prisoners who understood dark humor was sometimes the only way to survive. They called it the Hanoi Hilton, but there was nothing hospitable about this place. The French colonial architects who designed it in 1896 had built it specifically to crush the human spirit. The prison sat in the heart of Hanoi like a concrete tumor. 15-foot walls topped with broken glass and barbed wire surrounded the compound. Guard towers positioned at each corner gave Vietnamese soldiers clear sight lines into every courtyard, every cell block, every corner where a prisoner might try to find privacy or hope. Inside those walls, the architecture told a story of deliberate cruelty. The French had learned from decades of colonial occupation that breaking revolutionaries required more than just physical confinement. They needed psychological destruction. The cell blocks radiated out from a central courtyard like spokes on a wheel. This design meant guards could monitor multiple sections simultaneously while keeping prisoners isolated from each other. The concrete corridors amplified every sound: footsteps, screams, the metal clang of cell doors closing. Sleep became impossible when you could hear every moment of another man's suffering. Individual cells measured roughly 6 feet by 9 feet. Concrete floors, concrete walls, concrete ceiling. No windows except for a small opening near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind prisoners that a world existed beyond their cage. The tropical humidity turned these concrete boxes into ovens during the day and damp caves at night. The rats were everywhere. They'd lived in these walls for decades, growing fat on whatever scraps the prison system provided. Now, they had new food sources: the open wounds of American prisoners, the vomit from men who couldn't keep down their meals, the waste that accumulated when dysentery struck. Vietnamese guards moved through this environment with practiced efficiency. They weren't random soldiers assigned to prison duty. These men had been selected specifically for psychological operations. Many spoke English. Some had studied American culture and military procedures. They understood their prisoners' backgrounds, their training, their weaknesses. The guard hierarchy reflected North Vietnamese military precision. At the bottom were the young soldiers who delivered food and emptied waste buckets. They rarely spoke to prisoners and showed no emotion when Americans begged for better treatment or medical care. Above them were the interrogators. These men dressed in clean uniforms and spoke with educated voices. They knew each prisoner's name, rank, hometown, family members. They'd studied American military records and could recite details about bombing missions, aircraft specifications, unit assignments. At the top was the camp commandant, a man the prisoners learned to fear more than any torture device. He understood that breaking American pilots required more than physical pain. These men had volunteered for dangerous missions. They'd accepted the possibility of death. But they hadn't prepared for systematic psychological destruction. The commandant's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Strip away everything that defined these men as human beings: their uniforms, their ranks, their dignity, their basic nutritional needs. Force them to compete with each other for survival resources. Make them dependent on their captors for every calorie, every moment of relief from pain. The psychological warfare began the moment each prisoner arrived. Guards would search through personal effects, looking for photographs of wives, children, girlfriends. These pictures would disappear, leaving prisoners to wonder if their families still existed, still remembered them, still cared whether they came home. Letters from home were intercepted and read aloud during interrogations. Private family matters became tools for manipulation. A wife's casual mention of financial difficulties would be twisted into evidence that the prisoner's family was suffering because of his military service. The prison's daily routine was designed to break down military discipline and personal identity. Prisoners were awakened at random hours. Mealtimes changed without warning. Exercise periods were canceled arbitrarily. Medical care was provided or withheld based on cooperation levels during interrogations. But the most insidious element was the food system. Every American prisoner quickly learned that their survival depended entirely on their captors' willingness to provide barely edible meals. The psychological impact was devastating. Grown men, trained warriors, reduced to grateful acceptance of slop that would disgust a starving animal. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't the result of wartime shortages or logistical problems. This was a carefully designed system of control that used basic human needs as weapons against the human spirit. The North Vietnamese had studied their enemies well. They knew exactly how to destroy an American pilot without killing him. The North Vietnamese didn't stumble into using hunger as an interrogation tool. They'd studied it, refined it, turned it into a science. Their research went back to the French colonial period, when Vietnamese revolutionaries had been systematically starved in these same prison cells. Now, they were applying those lessons to American prisoners with surgical precision. The calorie mathematics were brutal and exact. A healthy adult male needs roughly 2,500 calories per day to maintain his body weight and mental function. The North Vietnamese provided between 700 and 900 calories daily. This wasn't enough to sustain life indefinitely, but it was precisely calculated to keep prisoners alive while slowly destroying their physical and mental resistance. Dr. Nguyen Van Thieu, who later defected to the South Vietnamese government, revealed the medical thinking behind this strategy. Vietnamese prison doctors had determined that American pilots could survive on starvation rations for months before permanent organ damage occurred. The key was keeping them in that sweet spot between death and health, weak enough to be compliant, strong enough to provide useful intelligence. The physical effects began within days. Muscle tissue started breaking down as bodies cannibalized themselves for energy. The human brain, which normally consumes about 20% of the body's total calories, began functioning at reduced capacity. Decision-making became impaired, memory suffered, emotional control deteriorated. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Reisner, shot down in 1965, documented the progression in his later memoir. Within 2 weeks on prison rations, he'd lost 15 pounds. His uniform hung loose on his shrinking frame. Simple tasks like standing up quickly left him dizzy and disoriented. His body was consuming itself to stay alive. But the psychological effects were even more devastating. Constant hunger became an obsession that crowded out all other thoughts. Prisoners found themselves unable to concentrate on anything except their next meal. Military training, escape planning, resistance techniques, everything took a back seat to the overwhelming need for food. The North Vietnamese understood this would happen. They'd observed the same pattern in their own people during the French occupation. Hungry men became predictable men. They could be controlled, manipulated, turned against each other with the promise of an extra bowl of rice. Major James Stockdale, the senior ranking officer among the prisoners, recognized what was happening but was powerless to stop it. The code of conduct required prisoners to resist interrogation and maintain military discipline. But how do you maintain discipline when your men are slowly starving to death? The Vietnamese exploited this dilemma ruthlessly. They offered better food to prisoners who provided information during interrogations, not classified military secrets necessarily, sometimes just personal details about family life, opinions about the war, criticisms of American military leadership. Each small cooperation was rewarded with slightly larger food portions. This created a moral crisis that no military training had prepared these men to handle. Was it worth compromising your principles for an extra spoonful of rice? What about when that rice might mean the difference between mental clarity and confusion during the next interrogation session? The starvation strategy extended beyond individual psychological pressure. It destroyed unit cohesion among the prisoners. Men who had flown combat missions together, who had trusted each other with their lives, began competing for food scraps. Friendships dissolved under the pressure of survival instincts. Captain Gerald Coffey later described watching fellow prisoners search through garbage for anything edible. These were men who had commanded million-dollar aircraft, who had been respected leaders in American society. Now they were reduced to fighting over moldy bread crusts like animals. The North Vietnamese documented everything. They kept detailed records of each prisoner's weight loss, behavioral changes, cooperation levels. They were conducting a large-scale experiment in human psychology using American servicemen as test subjects. International law was clear about prisoner treatment. The Geneva Conventions required adequate nutrition for captured enemy personnel, but North Vietnam had never signed these agreements, and the isolated nature of the conflict meant no international observers could monitor prison conditions. Compared to other prison systems worldwide, the North Vietnamese approach was uniquely sophisticated. Nazi concentration camps had used starvation as a method of extermination. Soviet gulags used it for punishment and control, but the Vietnamese had refined it into a precision instrument of psychological warfare. They weren't trying to kill their prisoners. Dead men couldn't provide intelligence or participate in propaganda efforts. They were trying to break them down systematically, to transform proud American warriors into compliant sources of information and political cooperation. The strategy worked. Within months, most prisoners had lost 30–40% of their body weight. Their immune systems collapsed, leaving them vulnerable to tropical diseases. Their mental resistance crumbled under the constant pressure of hunger and the body's desperate need for survival. But perhaps most importantly, the starvation strategy achieved its primary objective. It made every prisoner completely dependent on their captors for the most basic human need. Food became the ultimate weapon of control. The metal bowl arrived at McCain's cell door every day at exactly 11:30 a.m. The guard who delivered it never made eye contact, never spoke, just slid the container through the slot and walked away. Inside was what the Vietnamese called soup, but it bore no resemblance to anything Americans would recognize as food. The base was pumpkin, or what had once been pumpkin. The orange vegetable had been boiled until it disintegrated into a watery, brownish mush. But that was just the foundation for what prisoners soon learned was a carefully constructed nightmare. Floating on the surface were chunks of unidentifiable matter. Some pieces looked like vegetable scraps, potato skins, carrot ends, onion peels that should have been thrown away weeks earlier. The vegetables weren't just old, they were actively rotting. Green mold covered some pieces. Others had turned black with decay. But the vegetables weren't the worst part. Swimming in the murky liquid were what the prisoners called mystery proteins. Small, dark chunks that could have been meat, fish, or something else entirely. The smell suggested they were animal products that had been dead for far too long. Captain James Mulligan, shot down in March 1966, later described his first encounter with the soup. He'd been expecting something resembling the sea rations he'd eaten during survival training. Instead, he found himself staring at what looked like the contents of a garbage disposal. The smell hit him before he even lifted the bowl. Rotten eggs mixed with spoiled fish and something else. Something sweet and putrid that made his stomach clench. He forced himself to take a spoonful, thinking hunger would overcome his revulsion. He was wrong. The taste was worse than the smell. The pumpkin base had a sour, fermented flavor that coated his tongue and throat. The floating debris added textures that his mind refused to process, slimy, gritty, sometimes crunchy in ways that suggested insect involvement. Mulligan vomited immediately. The guard, who had been watching through the cell door slot, laughed and walked away. The message was clear: eat this or eat nothing. Other prisoners went through the same ritual of disgust and rejection. Lieutenant Commander John Borling tried holding his breath while eating, thinking he could avoid the smell. The strategy failed when he had to breathe, and the concentrated odor hit him like a physical blow. Major Sam Johnson attempted to eat only the liquid portion, avoiding the solid chunks entirely. But even the broth was contaminated with whatever had been rotting in it. For days. His body rejected it just as violently as if he'd eaten the solid pieces. The adaptation process was different for each man, but it followed a predictable pattern. First came outright refusal. The food was simply too disgusting to consume. Then came desperate attempts to make it palatable through various techniques. Some prisoners tried eating the soup cold, thinking heat intensified the awful flavors. Others attempted to eat it as quickly as possible, swallowing without chewing to minimize taste exposure. A few tried mixing it with water from their drinking rations, hoping dilution would help. Nothing worked. The soup was designed to be barely edible under the best circumstances, and these weren't the best circumstances. The prisoners were already weakened by injury, stress, and previous days without adequate nutrition. Their bodies were primed to reject anything that seemed potentially harmful. But hunger is a powerful motivator. After 3 or 4 days without food, even the most disgusting meal starts to look necessary. The human body's survival instincts eventually override the mind's revulsion. The breakthrough usually came during a moment of complete desperation. A prisoner would find himself so weak he couldn't stand, so hungry that his vision was blurring, so desperate that death seemed preferable to another day of starvation. In that moment, the pumpkin soup stopped being food and became pure survival. Men who had once been particular about restaurant meals found themselves grateful for slop that wouldn't be fed to pigs back home. The Vietnamese guards watched this transformation with clinical interest. They knew exactly how long it took for American pride to crumble under the pressure of basic biological needs. They had turned disgust into a weapon, and that weapon was devastatingly effective. The rice arrived in McCain's cell 3 days after he'd finally managed to keep down his first bowl of pumpkin soup. He looked at the small portion, maybe half a cup of what should have been white grains, and immediately noticed something was wrong. The rice was moving. Tiny black specks crawled through the grains like living pepper. Weevils, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, burrowing through what was supposed to be his primary source of calories. McCain had grown up in a military family, had eaten field rations during training, had prepared himself for substandard food during wartime. Nobody had prepared him for livestock in his lunch. The weevils weren't an accident or a sign of poor storage conditions. Vietnamese guards had access to clean rice when they wanted it. The infested grain was delivered to American prisoners deliberately as part of the same psychological warfare strategy that governed every aspect of their treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Reisner faced the same crawling meal in his cell 2 blocks away. He'd been shot down 6 months earlier and had already learned some hard lessons about survival in Vietnamese custody. But the weevil rice presented a new moral and practical dilemma that his military training hadn't covered. The insects were protein. His body desperately needed protein. The pumpkin soup provided almost none, and his muscle mass was disappearing daily as his system cannibalized itself for energy. From a purely nutritional standpoint, eating the weevils made sense. From every other standpoint, it was revolting. Reisner picked up a single grain of rice and examined it closely. A fat weevil had burrowed halfway through, its black head poking out like some microscopic alien creature. The insect was very much alive, moving its tiny legs in what looked like a desperate attempt to escape. The first time, he tried to pick out the bugs individually, one by one, grain by grain, separating the rice from the weevils with the patience of a man who had nothing but time. After 20 minutes of careful work, he'd managed to clean maybe a dozen grains while the weevils he'd removed crawled around the bottom of his bowl. It was hopeless. There were too many insects, and they were too deeply embedded in too many grains. He could spend hours cleaning his rice and still end up with a meal full of bugs. Other prisoners were facing the same impossible choice throughout the prison complex. Captain Red McDaniel tried crushing the rice first, thinking dead weevils might be more psychologically acceptable than live ones. The strategy backfired when the crushed insects released a bitter, acrid taste that made the rice even more unpalatable. Major Jim Stockdale attempted to wash the rice in his drinking water, hoping to drown or dislodge the weevils. Some bugs floated to the surface, but others clung to the grains or burrowed deeper when they sensed water. The debate among prisoners became philosophical as much as practical. Were they still maintaining their dignity as American officers if they ate insects? Was survival worth compromising their standards as human beings? Where was the line between necessary adaptation and complete surrender to their captors' degradation? The Vietnamese guards watched these internal struggles with satisfaction. They understood that forcing prisoners to eat insects accomplished more than just providing inadequate nutrition. It was another step in the systematic destruction of American identity and self-respect. But hunger makes philosophers of no one for very long. After days of starvation, the weevils stopped being insects and became calories. Men who had once been disgusted by the sight of a bug in their kitchen found themselves grateful for any source of protein, no matter how it was packaged. The acceptance process was gradual but inevitable. First came the decision to eat rice with a few bugs mixed in. Then came the realization that picking out insects was wasting precious energy and time. Finally came the moment when prisoners stopped seeing weevils as foreign contamination and started viewing them as part of the meal. Years later, some veterans would admit the weevils had probably saved their lives. The insects provided protein that kept their bodies functioning when the official prison diet would have led to complete physical breakdown. But that nutritional reality didn't make the psychological adjustment any easier to accept. The bread arrived on a Tuesday morning in November 1967, carried by a guard who seemed almost excited to deliver it. McCain looked up from his concrete floor as the metal plate slid through his cell door slot. Instead of the usual bowl of pumpkin soup, he saw something that made his heart race with unexpected hope. Bread. Actual bread. Brown, crusty, shaped like the baguettes he'd seen in French restaurants back home. For a moment, McCain allowed himself to believe his situation was improving. Maybe the North Vietnamese were softening their treatment. Maybe international pressure was forcing better conditions. Maybe this was the beginning of civilized prisoner care. He was wrong on all counts. The bread was a leftover from Vietnam's colonial period, when French bakers had supplied local prisons with surplus loaves. But this wasn't fresh bread from a French bakery. This was bread that had been stored in Vietnamese prison warehouses for months, maybe years. McCain picked up the baguette and immediately felt its weight, or lack thereof. The crust crumbled at his touch, releasing a cloud of green-black mold spores that made him cough. Underneath the moldy exterior, the bread had the consistency of cardboard soaked in dirty water. But it was still bread. And after weeks of pumpkin soup and weevil rice, even moldy French bread represented luxury. The smell told a different story. Instead of the yeasty, comforting aroma of fresh baking, this bread reeked of decay and something else. Something chemical that suggested the mold wasn't just surface contamination, but had penetrated completely through the loaf. McCain tried breaking off a small piece from what looked like the least contaminated section. The bread tore apart in stringy, fibrous chunks that resembled wet paper more than food. Green mold threaded through the interior like veins in marble. 2 cells down, Captain Coffee was examining his own moldy baguette with the same mixture of hope and revulsion. He'd been a prisoner for 8 months and had learned to approach any food improvement with suspicion. The Vietnamese didn't provide better meals out of kindness. They provided them as psychological manipulation. Coffee was right to be suspicious. Within hours, word spread through the prison that bread distribution wasn't random charity. Guards were watching to see which prisoners were desperate enough to eat moldy bread, which ones still had enough pride to refuse it. The bread became a test of desperation levels among the American prisoners. Those who ate it immediately were marked as completely broken, ready for intensive interrogation sessions. Those who refused were noted as still maintaining some resistance, requiring further softening through continued starvation. But the bread also became something the Vietnamese hadn't anticipated: currency. Prisoners began trading bread portions for other necessities. A piece of less moldy crust could be exchanged for help with medical care. A prisoner with dysentery might trade his entire bread ration for someone else's water portion. The French colonial connection wasn't lost on the more educated prisoners. They understood they were eating the literal leftovers of Vietnam's previous occupiers, consuming the remnants of another failed Western intervention in Southeast Asia. This symbolism was intentional. The Vietnamese wanted their American prisoners to understand they were following the same path as the French, foreign invaders who would ultimately be defeated and expelled, leaving behind only moldy reminders of their failed ambitions. The bread incident lasted 3 weeks before the Vietnamese stopped providing it entirely. But those 3 weeks taught the prisoners important lessons about survival, dignity, and the complex psychology of captivity that would serve them through years of imprisonment ahead. The bottle appeared in McCain's cell without warning on a humid Thursday morning in December 1967. The guard set it down next to his usual bowl of pumpkin soup, said something in Vietnamese that sounded like instructions, and walked away laughing. McCain stared at the dark brown liquid inside the small glass container. He'd never seen anything like it before, but the smell that escaped when he unscrewed the cap hit him like a physical assault. It was fish, but not fresh fish. This was fish that had been dead for months, maybe years, left to rot and ferment in tropical heat until it achieved a level of putrefaction that defied description. This was nuoc mam, fermented fish sauce, and it was about to become the most hated condiment in the history of American military service. The Vietnamese used fish sauce the way Americans used salt or pepper. It was a staple flavoring in traditional cuisine, made by layering fish and salt in wooden barrels and allowing the mixture to decompose over months. The resulting liquid was prized for its intense umami flavor and nutritional value. But what worked for Vietnamese palates raised on the sauce from childhood was pure torture for Americans encountering it for the first time under starvation conditions. Lieutenant Commander Coffee got his first taste when a guard poured the sauce directly into his pumpkin soup without asking. The smell alone made his eyes water. When he tried to eat the soup, the fish sauce overwhelmed every other flavor with its concentrated essence of decay. The taste was indescribable. Imagine the worst fish you've ever smelled. Multiply that by 100, then add salt and tropical fermentation. It coated the tongue and throat with an oily film that lingered for hours after eating. No amount of water could wash it away completely. Major Stockdale recognized what was happening immediately. This wasn't about nutrition or even cultural food differences. The Vietnamese had found another psychological weapon. They were forcing American prisoners to consume something that violated every instinct about safe food. The fish sauce strategy was particularly cruel because it made already barely edible meals completely revolting. The pumpkin soup was disgusting enough on its own. Adding fermented fish sauce turned it into something that triggered immediate vomiting reflexes in most prisoners. But refusing to eat meant starvation. And the Vietnamese made it clear that fish sauce would now be added to every meal, every day, for the foreseeable future. Captain McDaniel tried holding his breath while eating, but the sauce's oily consistency meant it coated his mouth and nasal passages regardless. The taste would hit him when he finally had to breathe, often causing him to vomit up whatever food he'd managed to swallow. Others attempted to eat around the sauce, consuming only portions of soup that seemed less contaminated. But the Vietnamese guards watched for this behavior and began mixing the sauce more thoroughly, ensuring every spoonful contained the maximum possible concentration. The psychological impact extended far beyond mealtime. The smell of fish sauce lingered in the prison corridors, a constant reminder of the degradation awaiting each prisoner at their next meal. Even thinking about eating became associated with nausea and revulsion. Some prisoners developed lasting aversions that persisted decades after their release. Veterans would report being unable to eat at Asian restaurants, unable to tolerate any fish-based seasonings, unable to separate the taste of fermented fish from memories of systematic torture. The Vietnamese understood they were creating these permanent psychological scars. They were weaponizing culture itself, using traditional Vietnamese flavors as instruments of psychological warfare against men whose only crime was serving their country in wartime. Fish sauce wasn't just a condiment in the Hanoi Hilton. It was liquid humiliation, served daily with a side of systematic dehumanization. December 25, 1967. Christmas morning in the Hanoi Hilton arrived with the same concrete walls, the same suffocating heat, the same smell of human waste and despair that defined every other day in captivity. But at 11:30 a.m., something different happened. The guard who delivered McCain's meal was smiling. Instead of the usual metal bowl containing pumpkin soup, McCain received a slightly larger portion served on what appeared to be an actual plate. The contents looked different too, still unappetizing, but with small additions that seemed almost festive by prison standards. A few pieces of what might have been chicken floated in the familiar brownish liquid. Some green vegetables that could have been lettuce or cabbage had been added. Most shocking of all, there was a small portion of white rice that appeared to be relatively free of weevils. McCain stared at this Christmas feast and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with crushing despair. The North Vietnamese weren't providing better food out of holiday spirit or religious respect. They were demonstrating their complete control over every aspect of their prisoners' emotional lives. They could provide slightly better meals when it served their purposes, which meant they had been deliberately withholding adequate nutrition every other day. Captain Coffee received a similar meal 2 cells away, along with something even more psychologically devastating. A handwritten note in English that read, "Merry Christmas from the People's Republic of Vietnam." The guard who delivered it watched Coffee's face carefully, documenting his emotional reaction for later use during interrogations. The holiday meal strategy was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. First, it reminded prisoners of everything they'd lost: family gatherings, traditional foods, religious celebrations, the basic human dignity of sharing meals with people who cared about them. Second, it demonstrated the Vietnamese captors' power to grant or withhold even small comforts. The message was clear. Cooperation might lead to better treatment, while continued resistance would mean returning to the usual starvation rations. Third, it created false hope that conditions were improving, making the return to regular prison meals even more demoralizing when it inevitably occurred the next day. Major Stockdale understood the manipulation immediately, but found himself powerless to resist its emotional impact. He'd been trained to resist interrogation techniques, but nobody had prepared him for the psychological complexity of receiving a slightly better meal on Christmas Day while imprisoned thousands of miles from home. The Vietnamese had studied American culture extensively. They knew that Christmas represented family, abundance, generosity, and spiritual renewal. By providing a marginally improved meal on this specific day, they were weaponizing prisoners' own cultural values against them. But the cruelest aspect was how the holiday meals highlighted the prisoners' complete isolation from their normal lives. Back home, their families were gathering around dinner tables loaded with turkey, ham, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and all the traditional foods that represented American prosperity and family bonds. Meanwhile, the prisoners were grateful for a few pieces of questionable chicken floating in the same disgusting soup they'd been choking down for months. Some prisoners tried to maintain holiday traditions despite their circumstances. They shared portions of their slightly improved meals with cellmates who were too sick to eat. They whispered Christmas carols during the brief periods when guards weren't monitoring their conversations. These small acts of defiance and human connection were exactly what the Vietnamese were trying to prevent. The holiday meals were designed to isolate prisoners emotionally, to make them focus on their own survival rather than maintaining bonds with fellow Americans. The strategy worked with devastating effectiveness. When the holiday meals ended and regular starvation rations resumed, many prisoners experienced a psychological crash that left them more vulnerable to interrogation pressure than they'd been before the temporary improvement. Years later, Vietnam veterans would report that holiday seasons remained difficult long after their release. The association between Christmas, Thanksgiving, and the memory of manipulative special meals in Vietnamese prisons created lasting trauma that affected their ability to enjoy family celebrations. The North Vietnamese had turned the most cherished American traditions into weapons of psychological destruction. They'd proven that even hope itself could be weaponized against men who had volunteered to serve their country in wartime. The holiday meals weren't gifts. They were psychological ammunition designed to break the human spirit one carefully calculated bite at a time. The hierarchy emerged within weeks of McCain's arrival at the Hanoi Hilton. It wasn't based on military rank or combat experience. Those distinctions meant nothing to Vietnamese guards who couldn't tell a Navy commander from an Air Force lieutenant. Instead, the prison's social order revolved entirely around access to food. At the top were prisoners who had medical conditions that qualified them for slightly larger rations. A man with dysentery might receive an extra portion of rice to help with recovery. Someone with infected wounds could get additional soup to maintain strength during healing. These medical exemptions created a twisted aristocracy where the sickest prisoners then suddenly became the most envied. Captain Gerald Coffey watched this transformation with growing horror. Men who had flown combat missions together, who had trusted each other with their lives at 30,000 feet, were now eyeing each other's food portions with barely concealed resentment. The bonds of military brotherhood were dissolving under the pressure of systematic starvation. The trading system developed organically as prisoners realized that survival required more than just eating their own meager rations. A man with severe diarrhea might trade his solid food for someone else's liquid soup. A prisoner with dental problems could exchange his rice for another's softer pumpkin mush. But the most valuable currency wasn't food itself. It was cigarettes. The Vietnamese occasionally provided American prisoners with cigarettes as rewards for cooperation during interrogations. These became the prison's primary medium of exchange, worth more than gold in an economy based on desperation. One cigarette could buy an extra spoonful of rice. 3 cigarettes might purchase someone's entire bread ration when the moldy French loaves made their irregular appearances. 5 cigarettes could secure a favor that might mean the difference between life and death. Help getting to the waste bucket when dysentery struck, assistance standing up when weakness made movement impossible. Lieutenant Commander Borling discovered the cigarette economy's darker implications when he watched 2 prisoners nearly come to blows over a single smoke. These weren't random strangers fighting over contraband. They were fellow Americans, fellow officers, men who should have been supporting each other against their common enemy. Instead, they were competing like animals for resources their captors deliberately kept scarce. The Vietnamese guards observed this breakdown of American unity with clinical satisfaction. They had successfully weaponized basic human needs, turning prisoners against each other without requiring any direct intervention. The Americans were destroying their own morale and military discipline simply by trying to survive. Medical exemptions became particularly corrosive to group cohesion. Prisoners began exaggerating symptoms or even injuring themselves to qualify for additional food rations. A man might reopen a healing wound to maintain his status as someone requiring extra nutrition. Others developed elaborate schemes to fake illnesses that would justify better treatment. They learned to simulate fever symptoms, to fake seizures, to create convincing displays of weakness that might earn them a few extra calories. The ethical implications were staggering. These were men trained to maintain honor under the most extreme circumstances, officers who had sworn oaths to uphold military values even in captivity. Now they were lying to medical personnel and competing with fellow prisoners for scraps of inedible food. Major Stockdale recognized what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. As the senior ranking officer, he tried to maintain some semblance of military order and mutual support among the prisoners. But how do you enforce discipline when men are slowly starving to death? The Vietnamese had created a perfect psychological trap. Maintaining military honor meant sharing resources equally and supporting weaker prisoners. But that same honor required staying alive to resist interrogation and eventual repatriation. These two imperatives were incompatible under starvation conditions. Some prisoners found ways to resist the system's corrosive effects. They formed small groups that shared resources regardless of individual need, creating islands of mutual support within the larger chaos of competition and desperation. But these acts of solidarity were exactly what the Vietnamese were trying to prevent. Guards quickly identified prisoners who were supporting each other and moved them to different cell blocks, breaking up any relationships that might provide psychological strength. The Hunger Games weren't just about food distribution. They were about destroying the fundamental bonds that held American military units together under combat conditions. The kitchen that prepared meals for American prisoners sat in a separate building behind the main cell blocks, hidden from view, but not from smell. The constant odor of rotting vegetables and rancid cooking oil drifted across the prison compound like a toxic cloud, reminding prisoners daily of what awaited them at mealtime. Nguyen Van Duc had worked in the prison kitchen for 3 years before the first American pilots arrived. He'd prepared meals for Vietnamese political prisoners, French colonial holdouts, and various enemies of the state. But cooking for Americans presented new challenges that went far beyond simple nutrition. The kitchen itself was a concrete room with no ventilation, equipped with massive iron pots that had been salvaged from French military installations decades earlier. The cooking fires burned constantly, fed by whatever combustible material the guards could find: wood scraps, paper, sometimes clothing stripped from new prisoners. Duke and his fellow cooks received their instructions directly from interrogation officers, not from any medical or nutritional authority. The meals weren't designed to sustain health. They were designed to break resistance. Every ingredient, every preparation method, every serving size was calculated for maximum psychological impact. The pumpkin soup that became the prisoners' daily torment started with vegetables that Vietnamese civilians had rejected at local markets. Duke would arrive at dawn to sort through rotting produce, selecting items that were spoiled enough to be disgusting, but not so contaminated that they would cause immediate death. He learned to identify the perfect level of decay, vegetables that would smell terrible and taste worse, but wouldn't actually kill the Americans before they could provide useful intelligence. It was a delicate balance that required experience and attention to detail. The mystery proteins floating in each bowl came from various sources that changed based on availability. Sometimes they were scraps from fish that had been dead for weeks. Other times they were organs from animals that had died of disease. Occasionally, Duke suspected they were things that hadn't been animals at all. But Duke wasn't completely heartless. He'd grown up during the French occupation and remembered what hunger felt like, what it meant to watch your family slowly starve while foreign soldiers ate well. Still, he sometimes found himself feeling sorry for the American pilots who choked down his deliberately awful creations. These moments of sympathy were dangerous. Guards monitored the kitchen staff as closely as they watched the prisoners. Any sign of kindness toward the Americans could result in immediate punishment or reassignment to even worse duties. Despite the risks, some kitchen workers found small ways to help. A cook might occasionally add a few extra grains of rice to a particular prisoner's bowl. Another might ensure that the least contaminated portions went to Americans who seemed close to death. These acts of mercy were rare and carefully hidden. but they represented something important. Proof that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, individual conscience could still assert itself against systematic cruelty. The kitchen staff understood they were participating in torture, but they also understood that refusing orders would mean joining the Americans in cells of their own. They were trapped in a system that demanded their cooperation in breaking fellow human beings through the most basic human need: food. Years later, some kitchen workers would defect to South Vietnam and describe their experiences preparing meals for American prisoners. Their testimonies revealed the calculated nature of the starvation strategy and the internal conflicts faced by Vietnamese civilians forced to participate in systematic psychological warfare. The human body wasn't designed to survive on 700 calories a day. Dr. Floyd Thompson, the longest-held American POW, would later describe the systematic medical breakdown that occurred when grown men were forced to subsist on starvation rations for months and years. Within the first month of captivity, prisoners began showing classic symptoms of severe malnutrition. Beriberi struck first, a vitamin B1 deficiency that caused swelling in the legs and feet, making walking painful and eventually impossible. Men who had once run 5-minute miles found themselves unable to stand without assistance. The swelling was grotesque and demoralizing. Ankles expanded to twice their normal size, stretching skin until it became translucent and threatened to split. Prisoners would press their fingers into the swollen tissue and watch the indentations remain for minutes afterward, proof that their bodies were retaining fluid while simultaneously wasting away. Captain Red McDaniel documented his own physical deterioration in mental notes he planned to share, if he ever made it home alive. He'd entered captivity weighing 180 pounds of solid muscle built through years of military fitness training. Within 6 months, he weighed less than 120 pounds and could count every rib through his paper-thin skin. The weight loss wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic. Prisoners lost an average of 10-15 pounds per month during their first year of captivity. Their bodies cannibalized muscle tissue for energy, leaving them looking like walking skeletons with hollow cheeks and protruding bones. But the physical changes were only the beginning. Malnutrition attacked every system in the human body with ruthless efficiency. Dysentery became epidemic throughout the prison population. The combination of contaminated food, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems created perfect conditions for intestinal parasites and bacterial infections. Prisoners suffered constant diarrhea that further depleted their already inadequate nutrition. The dysentery created a vicious cycle of deterioration. Men would lose precious calories through constant bowel movements, making their bodies even less capable of fighting off infection. The dehydration weakened them further, while the abdominal pain made eating the already disgusting prison food even more difficult. Dental problems emerged as vitamin C deficiency led to scurvy. Prisoners' gums became swollen and bloody, their teeth loosened in their sockets, and some men lost teeth entirely. Eating became agony even when food was available, creating another barrier to adequate nutrition. Major Sam Johnson watched his own teeth become loose and painful, knowing that losing them would make survival even more difficult. The prison diet required extensive chewing to break down the tough, fibrous materials that passed for food. Without functional teeth, prisoners faced the choice between swallowing large, indigestible chunks or going hungry. The psychological effects of physical deterioration were devastating. These men had been elite military personnel, proud of their physical conditioning and mental toughness. Watching their bodies waste away created a sense of helplessness that extended far beyond simple hunger. Hallucinations began appearing after several months of severe malnutrition. Prisoners reported seeing family members in their cells, smelling foods that weren't there, hearing conversations that existed only in their starving brains. The boundary between reality and fantasy became increasingly blurred as their minds struggled to function without adequate fuel. Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Risner experienced vivid dreams about elaborate meals that seemed more real than his waking hours. He would wake up convinced he had just finished eating a steak dinner, only to find himself staring at another bowl of rotten pumpkin soup. Depression became universal among the prisoner population. The combination of physical weakness, constant pain, and psychological torture created a mental state that military training hadn't prepared them to handle. Some men stopped eating entirely, preferring death to continued suffering. The Vietnamese prison medical system provided minimal care designed to keep prisoners alive without restoring their health. Prison doctors would treat life-threatening conditions just enough to prevent death, but they made no effort to address the underlying malnutrition that caused most health problems. Medications were used as rewards for cooperation during interrogations. A prisoner suffering from severe dysentery might receive antibiotics only after providing information to his captors. Pain medication was distributed based on compliance levels rather than medical need. The long-term medical consequences would haunt survivors for decades after their release. Many veterans developed chronic digestive problems, dental issues, and metabolic disorders that persisted throughout their lives. Their bodies never fully recovered from the systematic starvation they endured in Vietnamese prisons. But perhaps the most lasting damage was psychological. The experience of watching their own bodies waste away while being powerless to stop it created trauma that extended far beyond their years in captivity. The knock on McCain's cell door came at 3 a.m., hours before the usual meal delivery. 2 guards stood outside, one carrying the familiar metal bowl, the other holding what looked like an actual dinner plate. The contrast was deliberate and unmistakable. "You come now," the English-speaking guard said. "Special meeting." McCain had been through interrogation sessions before, but this one felt different from the moment he entered the small concrete room. Instead of the usual bare table and harsh lighting, someone had set up what almost resembled a dining area. A clean tablecloth covered the surface. Real silverware sat beside a plate that held food McCain hadn't seen in months. Roasted chicken, white rice without weevils, vegetables that looked fresh and edible, even a small portion of what appeared to be fruit. The interrogator, a thin man in a pressed uniform who spoke perfect American English, gestured toward the chair. "Please sit. You must be hungry." This wasn't the usual interrogation protocol. No shouting, no threats, no immediate demands for military information. Instead, the Vietnamese officer began serving food onto McCain's plate with the courtesy of a restaurant waiter. "Eat," he said. "We can talk while you enjoy your meal." The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and devastating. After months of choking down inedible slop, McCain found himself staring at what looked like a genuine dinner. His starving body screamed for him to eat immediately, but his military training warned him this was another form of torture. The interrogator seemed to understand McCain's internal conflict perfectly. "This food is not poisoned," he said, taking a small bite from the chicken. "It is simply better food. The kind of food you could receive regularly if you were more cooperative." The message was crystal clear. Better food was available, but it came with a price. Information, cooperation, betrayal of military secrets or fellow prisoners. Other American prisoners were experiencing similar dining interrogations throughout the prison complex. Captain Coffee found himself facing a meal that included actual bread, real soup, and what appeared to be fresh vegetables. The interrogator across from him asked casual questions about his family, his hometown, his opinions about the war. Nothing seemed classified or militarily sensitive. The questions felt like normal conversation between two people sharing a meal. But Coffee understood that each answer was being recorded, analyzed, and filed for future use against him or his fellow prisoners. The timing of these special meals was calculated for maximum psychological impact. They occurred after prisoners had been weakened by weeks of starvation rations, when their judgment was impaired by malnutrition and their resistance worn down by constant hunger. Major Stockdale recognized the strategy immediately when his turn came. The Vietnamese were using basic human physiology against their captives. A starving man's brain doesn't function normally. Decision-making becomes impaired. The overwhelming need for food can override years of military training and personal integrity. But the most insidious aspect was how the interrogation meals created guilt and internal conflict that lasted long after the sessions ended. Prisoners who ate the food felt they had somehow betrayed their principles, even if they revealed nothing of military value. Those who refused felt they had chosen pride over survival, potentially shortening their lives for symbolic reasons. The Vietnamese documented everything. They noted which prisoners were willing to eat the special meals, which ones asked questions about the food, which ones seemed grateful for better treatment. This information became part of detailed psychological profiles used to design future interrogation strategies. Some prisoners tried to find middle ground, eating the food while refusing to answer questions or providing only information that was already publicly known. But the Vietnamese were patient and sophisticated. They understood that accepting better food was itself a form of cooperation that could be gradually expanded over time. The confession meals, as prisoners came to call them, represented the intersection of physical torture and psychological warfare. They proved that even the most basic human need could be weaponized against men who had volunteered to serve their country in combat. The long-term impact extended far beyond the prison walls. Veterans would later report that sharing meals remained difficult for years after their release, that the association between food and interrogation created lasting anxiety around dining situations. The idea came to Captain Gerald Coffey during his 4th month of captivity as he stared at another bowl of weevil-infested rice. What if he could save enough food to sustain an escape attempt? What if other prisoners were thinking the same thing? Coffey had been studying the prison's daily routines, mapping guard rotations, identifying potential weaknesses in the compound security. But every escape plan hit the same fundamental problem. How do you survive in the Vietnamese jungle when you're already half-starved and weakened by months of malnutrition? The mathematics were brutal. A healthy man attempting to evade capture in hostile territory would need at least 2,000 calories per day to maintain the energy required for continuous movement. The prisoners were receiving less than 900 calories daily, and most of that came from inedible slop that would spoil within hours outside refrigeration. But Coffey wasn't the only one thinking about food hoarding for escape purposes. Throughout the prison complex, other Americans were quietly setting aside portions of their already inadequate meals, hiding scraps in their cells, trying to build reserves that might sustain a breakout attempt. Lieutenant Commander Borling discovered that rice could be dried and stored for several days if kept away from the rats and insects that infested every cell. He began saving a few grains from each meal, hiding them in a crack in his concrete wall where guards couldn't easily spot them. The hoarding process required incredible discipline. These men were already starving, and setting aside even a spoonful of food meant accepting additional hunger in the present for a theoretical future benefit. Every grain of rice saved was a grain not consumed by a body that desperately needed calories. Major Johnson tried a different approach, attempting to identify which components of the prison diet might be preserved for jungle survival. The pumpkin soup spoiled too quickly in tropical heat. The moldy bread crumbled into useless fragments. But the weevil-infested rice, disgusting as it was, could potentially provide sustenance during an escape attempt. The prisoners began sharing information about food preservation through the tap code communication system they'd developed. One man would pass along intelligence about which foods lasted longest without refrigeration. Another would share techniques for drying rice or vegetables in the humid prison environment. But the Vietnamese guards weren't stupid. They understood that food hoarding could indicate escape planning, and they conducted regular cell searches specifically looking for hidden rations. Getting caught with saved food meant immediate punishment, reduced meals, solitary confinement, or worse. The psychological pressure was enormous. Prisoners had to balance their natural survival instincts against the risk of discovery. Was it worth facing additional torture for the slim chance that hoarded food might support an escape attempt that would probably fail anyway? Some prisoners developed elaborate hiding techniques. They would hollow out small spaces in their concrete walls, create false bottoms in their waste buckets, or hide food inside their clothing during the brief periods when they were allowed to wash. The reality of jungle survival gradually became clear through intelligence gathered from failed escape attempts by other prisoners. The Vietnamese countryside was hostile territory where American faces would be immediately recognizable. Local civilians were encouraged to report escaped prisoners for rewards. Military patrols actively searched for escapees. Even if a prisoner managed to break out of the compound with adequate food supplies, he would face weeks of travel through unfamiliar terrain while being hunted by an entire nation. The hoarded rice and dried vegetables that seemed so precious inside the prison walls would last maybe 3 days in the jungle. But the escape planning served another purpose beyond its practical applications. It gave prisoners something to focus on besides their immediate suffering. The act of saving food, studying guard rotations, and imagining freedom provided psychological relief from the crushing reality of indefinite captivity. The Great Escape menu was ultimately more about maintaining hope than achieving actual freedom. The first time Captain James Mulligan saw a Vietnamese guard eating fish sauce with obvious pleasure, he couldn't understand how any human being could voluntarily consume something so revolting. The guard had poured the dark, pungent liquid over his rice with the same casual motion an American might use for ketchup or mustard. This wasn't just about different food preferences. This was about two completely incompatible ways of understanding what constituted edible sustenance. American palates had been shaped by generations of abundance, refrigeration, and food safety standards that made spoiled or fermented foods seem dangerous and disgusting. The idea of deliberately allowing fish to rot until it became liquid went against every instinct about safe eating that had been drilled into these men since childhood. Vietnamese cuisine, on the other hand, had evolved over centuries of scarcity, tropical climate, and the need to preserve protein sources without refrigeration. What Americans saw as dangerous decay, Vietnamese cooks understood as controlled fermentation that enhanced flavor and nutritional value. The cultural gap was enormous, and the North Vietnamese exploited it ruthlessly. They weren't just feeding prisoners unfamiliar food, they were forcing Americans to consume items that violated their deepest cultural assumptions about what constituted food versus poison. Lieutenant Colonel Reisner had grown up in Oklahoma, where meals centered around beef, potatoes, and vegetables prepared in ways that had remained unchanged for generations. His idea of exotic food was Mexican cuisine from a restaurant in Tulsa. Nothing in his background had prepared him for fermented fish paste, insect-infested rice, or vegetables that had been deliberately allowed to rot. But the Vietnamese guards eating the same ingredients seemed genuinely to enjoy them. They would laugh and chat while consuming meals that made American prisoners vomit. This created a psychological dynamic that went far beyond simple hunger. It made the Americans feel like they were failing at something as basic as eating. The religious and cultural food restrictions that many prisoners brought from home were completely ignored. Jewish prisoners who had maintained kosher diets their entire lives found themselves faced with pork products mixed into their daily soup. Catholic prisoners who had observed meatless Fridays were given fish sauce, whether they wanted it or not. These violations of religious dietary laws created spiritual crises that compounded the physical suffering. Men who had built their identities around following religious principles found themselves forced to choose between their faith and their survival. The adaptation process was different for each prisoner, but it followed predictable stages. First came outright rejection. The food was simply too foreign and disgusting to consider eating. Then came desperate attempts to make it palatable through familiar techniques, adding water, eating quickly, holding breath while swallowing. Eventually, some prisoners began to understand Vietnamese flavors on their own terms. They stopped comparing fish sauce to American condiments and started accepting it as a completely different category of food. This psychological shift was crucial for survival, but it also represented a fundamental change in cultural identity. Major Stockdale noticed that prisoners who successfully adapted to Vietnamese flavors often felt guilty about it later. They worried that accepting their captors' food preferences meant betraying their American identity, that survival required abandoning the cultural values they had volunteered to defend. The Vietnamese understood this internal conflict perfectly. They had experienced their own cultural food trauma during the French colonial period, when Western dietary preferences had been imposed on Vietnamese civilians. Now, they were reversing that dynamic, using food as a weapon of cultural domination. Years after their release, many veterans would report that their relationship with food had been permanently altered by their prison experience. Some developed lasting appreciation for Asian flavors they had first encountered under torture conditions. Others maintained lifelong aversions to any cuisine that reminded them of their captivity. The cultural shock of Vietnamese prison food wasn't just about taste preferences. It was about the fundamental question of what it meant to remain American while being forced to survive on the dietary traditions of an enemy culture. The delegation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1968. Their clean Western clothes and concerned expressions a stark contrast to the grim reality of prison life. International Red Cross representatives, journalists from neutral countries, and what appeared to be peace activists had come to document conditions at Vietnamese prisoner-of-war facilities. The preparation had begun 3 days earlier. Guards moved through the cell blocks with unusual efficiency, selecting specific prisoners for what they called special treatment. McCain found himself among the chosen, pulled from his concrete cell, and marched to a different section of the prison he'd never seen before. The room was a revelation. Clean walls, actual furniture, windows that let in natural light. Most, shocking of all, the smell of real food cooking somewhere nearby. After months of pumpkin soup and weevil rice, the aroma of what seemed like genuine cooking was almost overwhelming. A Vietnamese officer in a pressed uniform explained the situation with clinical precision. International visitors would be touring the facility. Selected prisoners would demonstrate how well they were being treated. Those who cooperated would continue receiving improved conditions. Those who didn't would return to their regular cells with reduced rations. The threat was clear, but so was the opportunity. For the first time in months, these men would have contact with the outside world, a chance to communicate their true situation to people who might actually help them. The staging was elaborate and sophisticated. Prison officials had created an entirely fictional dining facility, complete with tablecloths, proper dishes, and food that bore no resemblance to the daily slop that actually sustained the prisoners. When the cameras started rolling, McCain found himself seated at a table laden with roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, white rice, and what appeared to be fruit. The contrast with his usual bowl of rotting pumpkin soup was so dramatic it felt like a hallucination. The Vietnamese narrator spoke in English for the international audience, describing the humane treatment provided to American air pirates who had been bombing innocent civilians. The prisoners were encouraged to eat, while the cameras captured their apparent satisfaction with prison conditions. Captain Coffee, seated 2 tables away, faced an impossible dilemma. If he ate the food enthusiastically, he would be participating in propaganda that misrepresented their actual treatment. If he refused to eat or appeared unhappy, he risked severe punishment when the camera stopped rolling. The prisoners had developed subtle communication methods during their months of captivity. Through carefully positioned hands, slight facial expressions, and the tap code they'd adapted for visual signals, they tried to convey their real situation to the international observers. Some attempted to communicate distress through their eating behavior, taking unnaturally small bites, showing obvious reluctance, or trying to make eye contact with journalists in ways that suggested coercion. But the Vietnamese guards were watching for exactly these behaviors, and prisoners who seemed uncooperative were quickly removed from camera view. The propaganda meal lasted 2 hours, during which time the prisoners consumed more nutritious food than they'd seen in their entire captivity combined. The irony was devastating. They were being forced to eat well in order to lie about being starved. The international delegation seemed genuinely impressed by what they witnessed. They took notes about the adequate nutrition being provided, the civilized conditions of the prison facility, and the reasonable treatment of American captives. What they didn't see was the return journey to the real prison cells, where the same prisoners who had just performed satisfaction with their treatment were immediately returned to starvation rations and concrete floors. The psychological impact of the propaganda feast was more damaging than the physical deprivation that preceded it. The prisoners had been forced to participate in their own deception, to smile for cameras while misrepresenting the torture they endured daily. Major Stockdale later described the propaganda meal as one of the most demoralizing experiences of his entire captivity. The brief taste of adequate food made the return to regular prison conditions even more unbearable, while the forced participation in deception created guilt that lasted long after the cameras stopped rolling. The Vietnamese had achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. They had created international documentation of humane treatment that could be used to counter American accusations of torture. They had demonstrated their complete control over prisoners' lives, showing they could provide decent conditions when it served their purposes. Most importantly, they had forced the Americans to become complicit in their own propaganda. The feast wasn't about feeding prisoners. It was about feeding lies to the world while breaking the spirits of men who had been forced to participate in their own deception. The human mind wasn't designed to function normally under conditions of systematic starvation, but the American prisoners in Vietnamese camps developed psychological techniques that helped them survive what should have been unsurvivable circumstances. Major Sam Johnson discovered his first coping mechanism during his 3rd month of captivity, when the constant obsession with food threatened to drive him completely insane. Every waking moment had become consumed with thoughts of meals he'd eaten years earlier, elaborate fantasies about foods he might never taste again, and desperate calculations about when his next bowl of pumpkin soup might arrive. The breakthrough came when Johnson realized he could control these food obsessions by redirecting his mental energy toward detailed memory exercises. Instead of fantasizing about eating, he began mentally reconstructing every aircraft he'd ever flown, bolt by bolt, system by system, procedure by procedure. The technique worked because it required intense concentration that crowded out hunger thoughts while maintaining his professional identity as a pilot. He wasn't just surviving prison, he was maintaining his skills and knowledge for eventual return to duty. Other prisoners developed their own mental survival strategies. Captain Gerald Coffey began mentally designing and building houses, complete with detailed floor plans, electrical systems, and landscaping. The construction projects could occupy his mind for hours, providing relief from the constant awareness of his empty stomach. Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Reisner found salvation in religious meditation and prayer. He would recite Bible verses he'd memorized as a child, mentally attend church services from his hometown, and conduct elaborate theological discussions with himself about faith under extreme circumstances. But the most powerful psychological tool was the group support system that developed around mealtimes. Despite Vietnamese efforts to isolate prisoners and turn them against each other, the Americans found ways to maintain human connections that provided emotional sustenance when physical nutrition failed. The TAP code became their lifeline, a communication system that allowed prisoners to share encouragement, information, and solidarity through the concrete walls that separated their cells. During the awful moments when someone was choking down another bowl of rotting soup, he could tap out messages to fellow prisoners who understood exactly what he was experiencing. "Hang in there" became more than just words when transmitted through prison walls. It was proof that someone else cared whether you survived, that your suffering mattered to another human being, that you weren't completely alone in your struggle against systematic dehumanization. The religious and spiritual approaches to suffering varied among the prisoners, but served similar psychological functions. Some men found strength in viewing their ordeal as a test of faith that would make them stronger if they could endure it. Others drew comfort from believing their sacrifice served a larger purpose in defending American values and freedom. Major James Stockdale developed what he called Stoic philosophy, accepting that he couldn't control his circumstances but could control his response to those circumstances. The Vietnamese could force him to eat disgusting food, but they couldn't force him to lose his dignity or abandon his principles in the process. This mental framework helped prisoners maintain psychological distance from their physical degradation. They began viewing their bodies as temporary vessels that were being damaged by their captors, while their essential selves, their minds, spirits, and identities, remained intact and unconquerable. The dignity maintenance became crucial during the most humiliating aspects of prison life. When grown men were reduced to fighting over scraps of moldy bread or grateful for weevil-infested rice, they needed psychological mechanisms that preserved their self-respect and human identity. Some prisoners created elaborate mental rituals around eating that transformed the daily horror into something bearable. They would mentally set tables with proper place settings, imagine they were dining in fine restaurants, or pretend they were sharing meals with loved ones from home. These fantasies weren't escapes from reality. They were ways of asserting human dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it. By maintaining mental control over the eating experience, prisoners preserved something essential about themselves that the Vietnamese couldn't touch. The long-term psychological coping mechanisms often involved planning for the future in ways that assumed survival and eventual release. Prisoners would mentally prepare for reunion with families, plan career changes they wanted to make after the war, or design projects they would undertake when they returned to freedom. This future-focused thinking served multiple purposes. It maintained hope during the darkest moments, provided motivation to endure current suffering, and preserved the psychological framework necessary for successful reintegration into normal life after release. But perhaps, most importantly, the mental techniques for coping with starvation proved that human consciousness could transcend physical circumstances. The Vietnamese could control what went into prisoners' bodies, but they couldn't completely control what happened in prisoners' minds. That psychological freedom, maintained through disciplined mental practices, became the foundation for survival when everything else had been stripped away. February 12, 1973. The C-141 transport aircraft touched down at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, carrying the first group of American prisoners released from North Vietnamese captivity. McCain sat in his assigned seat, staring out the window at American military personnel waiting on the tarmac below. For the first time in over 5 years, he was breathing free air. The medical team that boarded the aircraft moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and documenting the physical condition of men who looked more like concentration camp survivors than military officers. McCain weighed 105 pounds, 60 pounds less than when he'd been shot down over Hanoi. But the most shocking moment came when a Navy corpsman approached with what he called a little snack for the flight home. McCain looked down at the tray and felt his mind struggle to process what he was seeing. A hamburger, French fries, a chocolate milkshake, an apple that was actually red and unblemished. Food that represented everything he'd dreamed about during those endless months of pumpkin soup and weevil rice. McCain picked up the hamburger with hands that shook from more than just physical weakness. The smell hit him first. Grilled beef, fresh bread, cheese, pickles, all the flavors that had existed only in his fantasies for years. He took one small bite and immediately felt his stomach clench in rebellion. His body couldn't process it. After years of subsisting on barely 800 calories of rotting vegetables and contaminated rice, his digestive system had adapted to survival rations. Rich American food was now as foreign to his body as Vietnamese fish sauce had been to his mind. Captain Gerald Coffey experienced the same cruel irony 2 seats away. The fried chicken on his tray looked perfect, golden brown, crispy, exactly like the meals he'd imagined during his darkest moments in captivity. But when he tried to eat it, his stomach immediately rejected the sudden influx of protein and fat. The medical officer supervising the refeeding process had seen this before. "Take it slow," he advised. "Your bodies need time to remember how to handle real food. We'll start you on liquid nutrition and work up gradually." The psychological impact was devastating. These men had survived years of systematic starvation by maintaining hope that someday they would eat American food again. Now that moment had arrived, and they couldn't even enjoy it. Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Reisner found himself crying as he stared at a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Not from joy, but from frustration and a grief he couldn't fully understand. The food represented everything he'd lost and everything he was struggling to reclaim. The flight to America took 18 hours, during which medical personnel carefully monitored each former prisoner's attempts to consume normal nutrition. They provided bland liquids, soft foods, and constant reassurance that the digestive problems were temporary. But the emotional reactions were more complex than simple stomach upset. Major Sam Johnson discovered that the taste of a chocolate bar triggered immediate flashbacks to his concrete cell, to the smell of fish sauce, to the sound of rats scurrying across prison floors. Freedom and trauma were becoming inseparably linked in his mind. The symbolic meaning of American food created its own psychological pressure. These meals represented home, family, normalcy, everything the prisoners had been fighting to return to. But their bodies' rejection of this food felt like rejection of America itself, like proof that they had been permanently damaged by their captivity experience. Dr. Robert Mitchell, the chief medical officer overseeing prisoner repatriation, understood they were witnessing more than just physical recovery. These men were learning that freedom wouldn't automatically erase the changes that years of systematic torture had made to their bodies and minds. The taste of freedom was bittersweet, literally. It represented hope and homecoming, but also the hard reality that some damage couldn't be immediately undone by a change of location or access to proper nutrition. The hamburgers and milkshakes were just the beginning of a long journey back to normal life. The kitchen in McCain's family home looked exactly the same as it had 5 years earlier, but everything felt different when he walked through the door in March 1973. His wife had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes, dinner rolls fresh from the oven. The smells that should have been comforting instead triggered immediate anxiety. McCain sat at the familiar dining table and stared at the plate in front of him. The portion sizes seemed enormous after years of subsisting on half cups of soup. The rich brown gravy pooling around the meat looked almost obscene in its abundance. His family watched expectantly, waiting for joy, for gratitude, for some sign that their husband and father had truly come home. Instead, McCain felt his stomach clench with the same anxiety he'd experienced before every meal in the Hanoi Hilton. The first bite of pot roast sent his digestive system into revolt. Not because the food was bad, it was perfectly prepared, exactly the way he'd dreamed about during those endless months of captivity. But his body had adapted to survival rations, and rich American cooking was now as foreign as Vietnamese fish sauce had once been. He excused himself from the table and vomited in the bathroom, leaving his family confused and hurt. How do you explain to people who love you that their care and cooking have become sources of trauma rather than comfort? Captain Gerald Coffey faced similar struggles in his own kitchen 3 states away. His wife had spent days preparing for his homecoming, stocking the refrigerator with all his favorite foods, planning elaborate meals that would help him regain the weight he'd lost during captivity. But Coffey found himself unable to eat more than a few bites at any sitting. His stomach had shrunk to accommodate starvation rations, and attempting to consume normal portions left him feeling nauseated and overwhelmed. Worse, the abundance of choices in his own refrigerator triggered panic attacks that he couldn't explain to his family. The psychological triggers were unpredictable and devastating. The smell of fish cooking would send Lieutenant Colonel Reisner into flashbacks so vivid he could taste the fermented fish sauce that had tortured him for years. The sight of rice made Major Johnson's hands shake with memories of weevils crawling through his daily rations. Family dinners became minefields of emotional trauma, disguised as loving gestures. Well-meaning relatives would pile food onto plates, encouraging the returned prisoners to eat up and get your strength back. They couldn't understand that eating had become associated with survival, desperation, and systematic humiliation rather than pleasure or family bonding. The medical supervision required during refeeding created its own psychological burden. Veterans found themselves under constant scrutiny from doctors who monitored their weight gain, tracked their caloric intake, and prescribed specific dietary regimens that felt uncomfortably similar to the controlled feeding they'd experienced in captivity. Major Stockdale discovered that his relationship with food had been fundamentally altered by his prison experience. Meals had become purely functional, fuel for survival rather than sources of enjoyment or social connection. The idea of eating for pleasure seemed foreign and almost immoral after years of watching fellow prisoners starve. The weight gain process was slow and often frustrating. Bodies that had adapted to extreme malnutrition couldn't immediately return to normal metabolism. Some veterans required months of supervised nutrition therapy before they could consume regular meals without digestive distress. Family relationships suffered under the strain of these eating difficulties. Wives who had planned elaborate welcome home feasts found themselves helpless as their husbands struggled with foods that should have represented love and normalcy. Children couldn't understand why their fathers seemed afraid of the dinner table. The long-term dietary changes became permanent for many veterans. Some developed lifelong preferences for simple, bland foods that reminded them of the institutional meals they'd received during medical recovery. Others maintained obsessive control over their food intake, unable to trust that adequate nutrition would always be available. Therapy approaches focused on separating current eating experiences from prison memories, but the process was complicated by the fundamental role food plays in family life and social interaction. Every meal became a potential trigger, every family gathering a reminder of how captivity had changed these men in ways that couldn't be easily healed. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. When Major Sam Johnson had served as a military police officer at Fort Leavenworth before his deployment to Vietnam, he'd overseen a prison system that provided 3 nutritious meals per day to inmates convicted of serious military crimes. Even the worst offenders, men guilty of desertion, assault, or theft, received better food than American prisoners of war were getting in Vietnamese camps. At Leavenworth, breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Lunch featured meat, vegetables, and bread that was actually edible. Dinner provided balanced nutrition designed to maintain health and support rehabilitation. The prison kitchen operated under strict sanitation standards, with regular inspections and medical oversight of meal preparation. Johnson remembered walking through the Leavenworth dining hall, watching American criminals eat food that would have seemed like a feast compared to the pumpkin soup and weevil rice he was now choking down in the Hanoi Hilton. The irony was devastating. His own country treated convicted felons better than North Vietnam treated captured military personnel. The Geneva Conventions were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of treatment. Article 26 specifically required that prisoner of war rations be equivalent in quantity and quality to those of the depot troops. Article 27 mandated that prisoners receive sufficient food to maintain good health and prevent weight loss. But North Vietnam had never signed the Geneva Conventions, and even if they had, the isolated nature of the Vietnam conflict meant no international observers could monitor compliance. The Vietnamese were free to ignore every standard of civilized prisoner treatment that had evolved over decades of international law. Captain Gerald Coffey had studied military history extensively before his deployment, and he understood that prisoner treatment had improved dramatically since World War II. Nazi concentration camps had used starvation as a method of extermination, but even in those horrific circumstances, some camps provided more calories than Vietnamese prisons were giving American pilots. Soviet gulags during Stalin's era had been notorious for brutal conditions and inadequate food, but their goal was punishment and forced labor rather than systematic psychological warfare. The Russians wanted their prisoners alive and capable of work, which meant providing enough nutrition to maintain basic physical function. The North Vietnamese approach was more sophisticated and arguably more cruel. They had calculated exactly how little food was required to keep prisoners alive while maximizing psychological pressure. It wasn't random cruelty. It was scientific torture designed to break resistance without causing death. The comparison with other wartime prison experiences revealed the unique nature of Vietnamese psychological warfare. German POW camps during World War II had often provided inadequate food due to wartime shortages, but they hadn't deliberately contaminated meals with rotting vegetables or forced prisoners to eat insects. Japanese prisoner camps in the Pacific had been brutal and often deadly, but their cruelty was typically direct and physical rather than the subtle psychological manipulation that characterized Vietnamese methods. Japanese guards might beat prisoners or withhold food entirely, but they didn't create elaborate systems designed to destroy dignity through forced consumption of degrading substances. Even Confederate prison camps during the American Civil War, notorious for their high death rates and terrible conditions, had provided food that was recognizably food rather than the deliberate slop that passed for meals in Vietnamese facilities. The evolution of prisoner treatment standards had been moving toward more humane conditions for decades before the Vietnam conflict. The 1929 Geneva Convention had established basic principles of prisoner care. The 1949 revisions had strengthened protections and expanded requirements for adequate nutrition and medical care. But all of these international agreements assumed that capturing nations wanted to maintain some semblance of civilized behavior, that there were limits to how far military forces would go in degrading enemy prisoners. The North Vietnamese had calculated that violating every standard of prisoner treatment would serve their strategic objectives without significant international consequences. The systematic nature of Vietnamese food torture became clear when compared to other military prison systems worldwide. This wasn't the result of wartime shortages, logistical problems, or individual guard cruelty. This was a deliberate policy designed and implemented at the highest levels of North Vietnamese military command. American prisoners understood they were experiencing something unprecedented in modern warfare: the weaponization of basic human needs by an enemy that had studied their psychology and designed their suffering with scientific precision. The comparison made their situation even more demoralizing, because they knew their own country would never treat enemy prisoners with such calculated cruelty. Dr. Robert Hayes adjusted his reading glasses and looked across his desk at the man sitting in the patient chair. It was 1995, more than 20 years after the end of the Vietnam War, and he was still treating veterans whose bodies bore the invisible scars of systematic starvation. The patient was Captain Gerald Coffey, now retired, who had come seeking help for digestive problems that had plagued him since his release from the Hanoi Hilton. Coffey's medical chart told a story that had become depressingly familiar to Hayes: chronic gastritis, irritable bowel syndrome, and what the medical community was beginning to recognize as food-related post-traumatic stress disorder. "I still can't eat rice without feeling sick," Coffey explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades-old trauma. "My wife makes perfectly good meals, but sometimes the smell of certain spices sends me right back to that concrete cell." "It's been over 20 years, Doc. When does it stop?" Hayes had been studying the long-term medical effects of prisoner malnutrition since the first POWs returned from Vietnam. What he discovered challenged everything the medical community thought they knew about the relationship between nutrition, trauma, and psychological recovery. The physical damage was extensive and often permanent. Veterans who had lost 30–40% of their body weight during captivity showed persistent metabolic disorders that affected their ability to process nutrients normally. Their digestive systems had adapted to starvation conditions and never fully readjusted to regular American diets. Major Sam Johnson, now in his 60s, still weighed significantly less than he had before his deployment to Vietnam. His body had learned to function on minimal calories, and attempts to return to normal eating patterns triggered anxiety responses that made weight gain nearly impossible. But the psychological effects were even more devastating and long-lasting. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma recovery, had interviewed hundreds of Vietnam POWs about their ongoing relationship with food and eating. These men experienced something unprecedented, Mitchell explained in her landmark 1993 study. They were systematically tortured through the most basic human need, nutrition. The psychological associations they formed between food and survival, between eating and humiliation, don't just disappear when they return to freedom. The family impact extended far beyond the veterans themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Risner's wife had spent decades learning to navigate her husband's food triggers, understanding which meals might cause flashbacks and which restaurants were safe for family dining. "I stopped cooking fish entirely," she explained during a support group meeting for POW families. "Even the smell of seafood cooking would send him into panic attacks. Our children grew up thinking their father was just a picky eater. They didn't understand he was reliving torture every time he sat down at our dinner table." The medical studies conducted on POW survivors revealed disturbing long-term health consequences that persisted decades after their release. Chronic malnutrition during captivity had damaged their immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to infections and autoimmune disorders throughout their lives. Dental problems from vitamin deficiencies had required extensive reconstruction that continued well into their retirement years. Many veterans had lost most of their teeth during captivity and struggled with proper nutrition even after receiving dental implants and prosthetics. The research also revealed intergenerational effects that nobody had anticipated. Children of POWs showed higher rates of eating disorders and food-related anxiety, apparently inheriting their father's complicated relationships with meals and nutrition through learned behaviors and family dynamics. Dr. James Stockdale, who had become a prominent advocate for POW issues after his release, established a foundation dedicated to studying the long-term effects of systematic starvation on military personnel. His research documented how food torture created trauma responses that were passed down through families like genetic inheritance. "The Vietnamese didn't just torture us," Stockdale wrote in his 1995 memoir. "They created a form of suffering that would continue affecting our families for generations. Every holiday meal, every family gathering, every simple dinner becomes a potential trigger for memories we can never fully escape." The advocacy work led to improved treatment programs for veterans dealing with food-related trauma, but the progress was slow and often inadequate. Many POWs struggled in silence for decades before seeking help, believing their eating difficulties were personal weaknesses rather than legitimate medical conditions requiring professional treatment. The legacy of hunger extended far beyond the prison walls of Vietnam, creating ripple effects that continued shaping lives, families, and medical understanding of trauma decades after the last American prisoner had returned home. Food became the perfect weapon because everyone has to eat. The North Vietnamese understood that controlling nutrition meant controlling everything: hope, dignity, resistance, and ultimately the human spirit itself. They proved that systematic starvation could accomplish what physical torture alone never could. If you want to see how this connects to modern psychological warfare, tactics, watch our deep dive into CIA interrogation techniques. Subscribe for more untold stories of survival against impossible odds.